but for those of you that have joined, welcome to Breaking Barriers, Navigating Childhood PTSD Through Expert Assessment and Diagnosis. I am Alexandra Beineman, and I'm here with Laurel Phillips. If this is your first webinar with us, welcome. And if you are a return attendee from the different webinars we've done in the past few years, welcome back. We're excited to have you and really just love getting to share some different groundbreaking information with you and ensuring that our community members that are providers for kids or that work with kids have the best knowledge at their fingertips so that they can be the best or the most impactful as possible with the children that we serve in our communities. So like I said, I am Alexandra Beineman, and I am the Director of Program and Staff Development here at Camber Children's Mental Health. And I'm here with Laurel. And Laurel, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laurel Phillips. I'm the Associate Clinical Director at our Camber Children's Mental Health Kansas City location.
Awesome. And so Laurel and I are going to start off with kind of sharing our whys with you. And this is going to come full circle towards the end of our training today. And so when we talk about our why, what we're meaning is why we do the work that we do. And so for me, I do this work for a multitude of reasons, but what really drives me is a sense of connectedness. I believe that as a human race, we are all connected. I believe that we are here to support one another, that we need each other to be successful, and that the stronger that our communities are, the healthier and more successful every single individual is going to be. So that's why I show up to work every day. I have a huge passion for children, a huge passion for the mental health field. But ultimately my core value of like connectedness and feeling as though I'm interconnected to the people around me really drives the work that I do every day.
Thanks, Alex. So my why, it's changed over my career, but for right now, my why, I'm really passionate about providing high quality clinical care to youth and families that are experiencing crisis. But I also recognize that we're not going to be able to solve that problem overnight. It's not an easy, quick solution to anything. So for me to be successful, and my why right now is to help those that care for those that are in crisis take care of themselves so that they can continue to do that work and use their expertise to partner alongside families as they need help.
Thanks, Laurel. And Laurel's going to lead us through some conversations around some of that, like self-care and really trying to support like the workforce that works with this population here at the end of our presentation today. So feeling really connected to what you're doing there, Laurel, and we appreciate you being here with us. So today, we are going to kind of have three main objectives to achieve while we're here. And our goal is that after participating in this session, that you should be able to understand the DSM-5 TR diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, identify effective assessment tools for PTSD evaluation, and there are quite a few out there, and then apply diagnostic knowledge through, and there's a typo, I am so sorry, through a culturally competent lens. So we really want to make sure that we are able to not only use these assessments and evaluations and understand, the list of criteria that the DSM provides, but that we're able to do that with all of the different children that we serve in a way that meets them where they are, that is culturally competent, that doesn't isolate part of their identity or a part of their family's identity in any kind of way, or potentially lead to a misdiagnosis of some sort if we're not, engaging in that cultural competency. So we do have a polling question here. I have to remember how to launch a poll. Here we go. So if everybody could just go ahead and answer the polling question. I just launched it. And we're just looking to ask the question, how many people worldwide do you think experience trauma? So I'll leave this open here for just a few minutes and we'll see some of those polling answers come through. And Laurel, are you able to see the poll? You are?
I see the poll, yeah.
Okay.
Answers are coming in quick, so.
Yeah, fantastic. Just making sure everyone can see what's going on. So I'll give everyone just a couple more seconds and then we'll go ahead and look at these answers. Okay, let's see what the results are saying. So it looks like, let's see what brings me back to here. Okay, so it says a lot of people are saying over 1 million, 95%, 70%, 75%, 1 and 2, which is about 50%. So that is a pretty good estimation of the amount of people that are experiencing trauma. So we're going to get into that number here in just a minute, but I wanted to kind of start with that idea just so that we can really understand the amount of people that are affected by this. And not everyone who has trauma is going to result in a PTSD diagnosis, but it's important to understand the widespread effect of trauma in our global population.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. So we're going to start first by looking at the history of PTSD and its formation as a diagnosis in the DSM. So there are documented accounts of the effects of trauma and stress on humans dated as far back as 1666. So symptoms like nightmares, rapid heart rate, irritability, and hyperarousal were documented all the way back from that time period. Historically, those symptoms were noted to be related to major accidents, natural disasters, fires, railroad derailments, and war. One example that was documented was about a corporal who was buried in his trench when a shell hit him. So he was physically unharmed, but there were noted physical changes in his heart rate. So for example, his typical resting heart rate would be 60 beats per minute. And then if there was some unexplained noise or someone hit a table next to him, his heart rate would jump to 120 beats per minute. So that just really documents how, even though he didn't have physical ailments or injuries from this attack, there were physiological changes to his body based on that trauma he had experienced. And then in 1937, we see the first documentation of the effects of physical and sexual abuse on folks. And so specifically, this was looking at ages 5 to 13 years old. All of these accounts were based on adults, but looking back into their previous past as a child. And we saw similar symptoms documented for children and adolescents following exposure to air raids, other war-related effects, and other trauma. It's important to note that a lot of the data, just like Alex kind of mentioned at the beginning of our objectives, the APA used to formulate diagnostic criteria for PTSD and its prior forms are lacking data from the non-white experience. So we'll talk more about racial bias and how it's related to PTSD diagnosis later in our webinar today. In 1952, we see that the APA responds to all the evidence that I just described by including the diagnosis gross stress reaction in the DSM-1. So while this is an official recognition of the extreme stress that causes psychological effects, it still didn't provide any operational criteria or any way to provide someone with that diagnosis. It was just kind of a recognition of, yes, we realize that this does have an impact on folks psychologically. When the DSM-2 was released, the APA removed that gross stress reaction index diagnosis and then instead added transient situational disturbance, which is a new diagnosis, but was still missing operational criteria for diagnosis. So it's not until the DSM-3 that we see the formal post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis recognized and with operational criteria for diagnosis. PTSD then underwent multiple revisions in the DSM-3R and the DSM-4.
Thank you. So let's look at what's happening right now. So that's kind of the history of the diagnosis, which we understand, while it is amazing to have that operational criteria now and be able to apply that diagnosis, we know that there's areas that criteria is missing, that there's still research and a lot of evaluation to be done on all of the kind of the Western psychiatric diagnosis that we have, because they are all from one culture. But looking at what's happening right now, so what do we have going on? So according to the National Center for PTSD, about 4% of children under the age of 18 are exposed to trauma in a way that will lead to a PTSD diagnosis. And if you look at the bottom of our orange box here, we have about 3% to 15% of girls developing PTSD and 1 to 6% of boys developing PTSD. And this is for youth specifically. Now, for that question that we asked in our polling question just a minute ago, about 70% of the world population has experienced at least one trauma or will report that they've experienced one trauma. Trauma is somewhat, is subjective to how a person experiences it. So this is a self-reported analysis. So there could obviously be more trauma or things that other people would perceive as traumatic for someone, but 70% of the world population is reporting having experienced one trauma. Some interesting kind of other things that we're seeing here is that higher rate of diagnosis for female identifying individuals versus male identifying individuals. And then if you look at the National Center for PTSD's data on the LGBTQIA+ population, I do want to clarify that this data does include adults, while the data on the other side of the screen is just children, except for that 70%. But we're looking at 48% of LGBT individuals meeting PTSD criteria and 42% of transgender and gender diverse individuals meeting PTSD criteria. I think anytime that we're looking at data like this, we have to know that access to care, to even, conceptualize some of these things is a huge barrier to whether or not some of this data is accurate. Whether or not people are willing to self-report a lot of this data is also a barrier. So a lot of this, while it is very impactful and it does need to guide a lot of where we put dollars towards research and things like that, it's also important to know that these are probably slightly underestimated, if not more than slightly underestimated numbers of the PTSD prevalence. We know that LGBTQIA plus individuals are nearly 4 times as likely to experience a violent assault than their cisgender counterparts. And we also know that sexual violent assaults are one of the leading causes of a PTSD diagnosis. So looking at their likelihood of experiencing those violent types of assaults being increased, we're really making sure that that's kind of leading to the higher number of diagnoses that we're seeing, and something that's really important to focus on when we're working with LGBTQIA plus youth. So there's some data missing from here, and it would be data related to diagnostics based on racial minorities and ethnicities. And I kind of wanted to, and you can just put your response in the chat. I'm not going to launch a poll for this one, but what do we think are maybe some of the reasons that we don't have data related to youth diagnosis based on the demographics of racial identity or ethnic identity? We're missing a lot of that data. It's really hard to come by. Why do we think that might be happening? Anyone want to answer in the chat? And these might be coming through the Q&A, Brittany, as well. So looks like, we've got quite a few things coming in here. Scroll to the bottom as they come up. But mislabeling, mental health stigma, more reliance on spirituality, people aren't reporting their trauma, shaming people for reporting it. These are all very accurate statements as to why we don't have that data, as well as I don't know that we're looking for it in the way that we should be. We're going to get into some research around those disparities in the second half of our presentation today. But what we've really discovered, and what Laurel and I discovered looking through this, is that a lot of the research that we need to really be informed about working with BIPOC youth in our communities doesn't exist. And there isn't a lot of data that really supports the integration of the different experiences that maybe lower socioeconomic status would create or things like that. So we're going to talk more about that, but I find it really interesting that when I was trying to create this slide, I couldn't access that data because it wasn't out there in a way that was quantifiable for this purpose. Okay, so we're going to hop into looking at risk factors and causes. And these are pretty well known already. I think that we understand what trauma is and what things can cause trauma or cause a significant impact of trauma. But we have things like domestic violence, and that's both experiencing it and witnessing it. Abuse and neglect, both experiencing it and then also witnessing the abuse of maybe a sibling or somebody else in the home. Serious accidents, so that would be, car crashes or other serious things that maybe left someone with a serious injury, or were maybe just really scary and created kind of that reaction within their brain and their nervous system. Sometimes medical procedures can lead to PTSD or other trauma-related disorders. The same thing with terminal illness. Inadequate family dynamics or unstable family dynamics absolutely can lead to that. Natural disasters, we see a lot of research come after things like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, things like that. Traumatic death, so the traumatic death of someone that you care about, someone that you know, someone that is involved in your life in some capacity, can be very traumatizing. Active shooter events, which I know is a large thing that we're unfortunately having to focus on as a community with our youth, is the fact that we're seeing this happen in spaces that our youth are in, and they're witnessing this happen to their peers and to their loved ones. And so this is one that I think we need to really spend more time kind of understanding. We're going to talk about the effects of ongoing stress on PTSD in the second half of this presentation. And I think that that's a caveat that needs to be discussed with some of the other ongoing stresses that our youth are experiencing. Sexual violence, which I mentioned previously, is a large risk factor and cause of PTSD. Violent crime, so any sort of, victimization by violent crime is going to be a risk factor. Global disasters, media stories, war isn't on here, but that's another one that war or large scale genocide, things like that are obviously very, very traumatic and can cause some pretty significant PTSD symptoms. I am going to launch another poll here, and I'm curious, there is something specific missing from this risk factors, and I would love to see, sorry, I got to go back real quick and end this other poll. I would love to go back and see, or kind of get your idea on what do you feel like is missing from this situation. Okay, so let's see what we're seeing here. So what may be missing from this list of risk factors and causes? And I appreciate y'all's engagement today. It really helps us kind of understand where you guys are at and keep everyone engaged. It can be really hard on a meeting this large or a webinar this large to keep everyone engaged throughout the training. So thank you for your participation.
Hey, Alex, there was a question. Let me know when you're ready for it.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and ask it while people are answering
Okay.
one question.
So one of the questions was, does the data about the percentage of girls and boys who meet criteria account for social conforming differences? Meaning the way boys and girls are socialized often is quite divergent and it could present differently in different gendered people.
Yes, so that is kind of, I mean, it wasn't as clearly stated as that when I was going through the research, but it is likely due to like kind of cultural socialization and the way that we kind of bring up more traditional gender roles, or the way that people more traditionally conform to gender roles, definitely affects some of those rates. I also think that it has to do with some of the maybe stigmas around reporting some of these emotional things, like historically as a male identifying human or things like that, kind of contribute to maybe we're not seeing, you know, as much of that self-reporting of that seeking services that we are from female identifying individuals. Okay, so let's take a look at these questions here and see what we are looking at. I can share this. See if it pops out for me. There we go. And it looks like, I'll put this back up here. We have abandonment. That's a great one. Being in foster care. And then for this being in foster care, also surprised that media stories is part of a risk factor. Didn't think it was part of the diagnostic. We're going to talk about that. It is not part of the diagnostic criteria, but we're going to talk about how maybe some of the criteria needs to be kind of reconceptualized. Migration, systemic trauma, religion. The systemic trauma is huge. Obviously, religion, mitigation if you're having, or migration if you're having negative experiences, secondary trauma, support systems, bullying, being transient, I like that. Racial discrimination, microaggressions. So this racial discriminations and microaggressions is the answer that we were more specifically looking for. However, everything listed is definitely something that could be considered a risk factor or a cause, but it is not. So what we're kind of searching for is that currently experiencing racial discrimination is not categorized as a risk factor for PTSD. However, current and ongoing research is showing that that's likely going to need to be reevaluated. So let's get into what some of that criteria looks like. So there is different diagnostic criteria for individuals who are under the age of 6 years old, and we'll kind of go over some of those changes here at the end of this presentation. But in order for you to be diagnosed, or for an individual to be diagnosed with PTSD, they have to have one symptom that is showing up at least 6 months post-traumatic event, or kind of the start of this experience after. So at least one in each of these different symptom categories after the event. So for criterion A, these are going to be symptoms related to like direct exposure. So we need to have a direct exposure to death, or to threaten death, to threaten serious injury or actual serious injury, or threaten sexual violence or actual sexual violence. And this can be done through that direct exposure, through witnessing the trauma of another one, for learning that trauma has happened to a close relative or friend, or that indirect exposure to adverse details of the trauma. So that's normally going to be that secondary trauma through like the different professions that we have as first responders, medics, social workers, things like that. We're just absorbing so much of the trauma that people that we work with go through that it can end up having a pretty significant effect on us as well. And we're going to have a lot of conversations around the criteria in A trauma as we continue through this training. The criteria B, there's also one that's required for diagnosis, and that this is the symptoms of kind of like re-experiencing. So the traumatic event needs to be persistently re-experienced either through unwanted upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress to exposure, after exposure to traumatic reminders. So if there are different trauma triggers that the individual is experiencing, that those are bringing up emotional distress, that is making it hard for them to manage their emotions. And then physical reactivity after trauma to traumatic reminders would be more physical behaviors that we're seeing after being exposed to some of those traumatic reminders or triggers. And then the criterion C symptoms that we're looking at here. There's also one required in criterion C, and these are our avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma. So either like avoiding thoughts and feelings, or avoiding those reminders in a way that's like impairing day-to-day functioning. So all of these have to be significant enough to be impairing day-to-day functioning, whether working with youth, they're unable to complete schoolwork, to attend school, to engage in the activities that they would normally be engaging in, because either they're fearful of being exposed to one of those trauma reminders, or they're struggling with emotional distress and are trying to avoid those thoughts and feelings from the trauma that they experienced. So moving on to criterion D and E. So for criteria D, we are looking at negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways. So this would be individuals who maybe are having an inability to recall key features of the trauma, or can't remember the details of what happened to them or to the event that they were a part of. We hear a lot of people talk about suppression and things like that, or experience suppression, or have kind of these memories resurge after kind of engaging in conversations about it. So overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world would be another symptom that would fit this criteria. Exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma. So kind of that inherited belief that maybe I'm wrong because of this trauma that I experienced, or that it was my fault, or kind of exaggerating the blame onto others to places where it impairs our ability to function because we're so angry, or that blame is so large, or we can no longer engage in systems that benefit us or that are a part of our day-to-day functioning because of the blame for that event. Negative affect, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive affect. And so, a lot of these are also like kind of depression symptoms and things like that. So we're looking for at least 2 of these symptoms to be present 6 months post the event, and in a way that is affecting day-to-day functioning. And then criterion E, trauma. We are looking at trauma-related arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the trauma. So irritability and aggression are kind of the 2 main arousal behaviors that are being looked for, and that can be viewed through risky or destructive behavior, maybe like a lack of self-preservation or personal safety and engaging in really dangerous activities. Hypervigilance, so high startle reflex, feeling anxious all the time, unable to kind of focus and like be present in where they are because of that heightened startle reaction, which kind of goes with the hypervigilance. The difficulty concentrating, unable to focus on the task at hand, unable to switch from task to task effectively. And then difficulty sleeping, which we saw some issues with nightmares being a potential symptom in some of the other criteria. So those kind of go hand in hand. And again, 2 are required for this section of criteria in order for a PTSD diagnosis. Criterion F through G is more related to the duration of symptoms or kind of the severity of symptoms. And so we're needing symptoms to last for more than 1 month. So these need to be something that is affecting an individual for more than 1 month of time. It's not getting any better. It's staying at that level or getting worse. Symptoms create clinically significant distress or functional impairment. So these symptoms are making it very difficult for these children or adults to continue to function in their day-to-day life, to uphold their responsibilities, and to meet the needs of anyone that maybe they are in charge of meeting needs for. And that we also are sure to rule out that these symptoms are not due to medication they may be on, substance use, or other illnesses. So that really comes in effect with like flashbacks or disassociation, or some of those more changes in cognition that could be affected by substance use or another illness or a medication.
Hey, Alex, there is a question in the Q&A, and it said, I have been asked How to define serious injury? Are there any standards for this?
That's a great question. So I think that that's in criterion A. I think that that's really difficult. I did not find anything that was specific to define serious injury. The way that I, as a professional, would approach this, and Laurel, I'd love to kind of hear your thought about this, is if that was perceived as the client as something that could be a serious injury, then that is enough to have it have the level of effect it would need to have for a PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah, so, and we'll talk more about that later, but you're right, Alex. I mean, essentially it's the perception of the person that's experiencing that. And so for them, if they felt that their life was truly in danger, based on whatever they experienced in the serious injury, then that could have the same kind of psychological effects as, something that, so everyone's perception of that's going to look different, but what's important is kind of recognizing the perspective of the youth or child that you're talking to about what they experienced.
Yeah. And when talking about serious injury, I mean, I think that some of that goes with like, what does it affect in your life? Like if there's something that you do that you are really passionate about, or that drives a lot of your life, and then some sort of injury, even if it's not a life-threatening injury, impacts your ability to do that activity or to be engaged that way, I feel like that can have that same negative traumatic effect, even though it wasn't necessarily life-threatening or like serious by medical standards.
Yeah. And we have to think too about, because of developmentally, youth their perception of what's a serious injury or life-threatening is going to maybe be inaccurate, just because their brain is still developing that frontal lobe piece that's going to really help them assess that. So that's going to make it all look kind of dynamic and change as well.
Absolutely. I think child development plays a large role in kind of diagnosing any mental health condition as in adolescence or childhood.
There is one additional question. Does dissociation fall into any of the criteria?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that dissociation is falling into both kind of criterion B and C with avoidance. So this would be kind of like that disassociation due to like flashbacks would be in criterion B, and then disassociation in a way to avoid those thoughts or feelings or avoid those trauma triggers is going to fit into criterion C.
I think you go more into dissociation in your next slide too, Alex.
Do I think you? I was like, I know I have information on it.
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So there are two specifications of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And again, this is for 6 and up. So we have the disassociative specification and then the delayed specification. So the disassociative specification is going to be that in addition to meeting all of that criteria, they're experiencing the high levels of either of the following trauma-related stimuli, being depersonalization. So being an outside observer or detached from oneself. It's not happening to me. It was a dream. Having like an out-of-body experience, kind of feeling like you're on the outside of a room. I think we've all been in that state where you feel like kind of the world's happening in front of you for a minute. These people are kind of stuck in that. They're not able to engage in their day-to-day life. And then we have derealization, which is that experience of unreality, of distance, of distortion, of kind of struggling to figure out what's real and not real and kind of feel that. So those are the two specifications or two different areas of specification for dissociative specification. And then we have delayed specification, which is where this full diagnostic criteria isn't met until after 6 months. So we really want to see these symptoms last for more than 1 month, but like continue up to 6 months. This is going to be where none of this is like fully present until after 6 months. So maybe we struggle with a couple of symptoms in the immediate aftermath, but once we hit 6 months, we're starting to see the addition of criteria symptoms. And so that's going to be that delayed specification. And again, that is specific to individuals who are above the age of 6. And then Laurel's going to kind of clarify for us some changes for individuals under the age of 6.
Yeah. So, what we know about child development tells us that the brain is developing at a really rapid rate from 0 to 5 to 6 years old, right? And so because of that, the DSM did want to account for differences in how youth under the age of 6 present symptoms and what PTSD is going to look like that for them at that age. And so, if you can kind of think back to that first slide that Alex was talking about, one of the changes is they did remove that last A4 from criterion A, which talks about that indirect exposure. So that makes sense because youth under the age of 6 aren't going to have vicarious trauma typically, right? And then also it looks at A3, which talks about learning that trauma happened to a close relative or a close friend. Really, that's going to focus for youth at this age with a parent or caregiver, right? When you're under the age of 6, your whole world is whoever that primary caregiver is. And so that's where that's really focused on for youth under the age of 6. For those intrusive symptoms, some children don't kind of display that overt distress in the same way, or those intrusive unwanted thoughts. And so this research has shown that preschool age children kind of display instead kind of more neutral or over bright affect. And some distressed reactions are common, but parents also reported sometimes there was no affect, or what appeared to almost be excitement, right? So that kind of speaks to their brain's inability really to process what they're experiencing in a lot of ways. So there's no differences in PTSD severity for those who are displaying overt distress versus those who have those more withdrawn reactions with youth. So that doesn't mean that PTSD is more severe in someone under the age of 6 who's displaying more severe symptoms. For the avoidance symptoms and negative alterations in cognitions, this was kind of the largest area that we saw change. So again, if you kind of think back to that slide where we were looking at criterion D and criterion E, we talked about how there were 2 required under each of those sections. So for youth under the age of 6, they removed that requirement and said only 1 was required. They also looked at removing the inability to recall an important aspect of event and that sense of a shortened future, just due to developmental levels of children at this age. And also we had the diminished interest in significant activities. For youth this age, it's not going to really look the same. It's going to look more like a constricted play, or feelings of detachment from those that are important to them, and then also being behaviorally or socially withdrawn. And finally, with that increased arousal symptoms, for irritability or outbursts of anger, we're going to see more of those extreme temper tantrums and kind of that loss of regulation of their emotions. So we're going to talk a little bit now. We've looked at the criteria. So let's talk through assessments that can help us in deciding if a youth would meet criteria as well for PTSD. So there's a lot of different assessments that are in use for assessing for PTSD. In one study, they found that they reviewed 4,000 abstracts in clinical trials from 2005 to 2020, and there were over 1,400 unique instruments that were being used. So some of the instruments that are noted in this study were the PTSD checklist, the clinician administered PTSD disorder scale, the patient health questionnaire, and the Beck depression inventory. Another assessment that's used is the UCLA PTSD reaction index. So that's a self-report questionnaire, and it's used with children and adolescents to screen for traumatic exposure. There's no requirement to use any of these specific instruments to find a PTSD diagnosis, but they can be helpful with increasing someone's understanding themselves of trauma they've experienced, but also can help caregivers understand a youth's experience with trauma as well.
I think as a provider for youth, that can be really difficult at times to really help a parent understand what their child is going through. And so when we were doing this research, I felt like that was a really big resource to anyone working with kiddos who've experienced trauma and really trying to help the family engage and understand.
Yeah, especially how we talked about, it's really about perspective and that individual's experience. And so, you know, in my experience, it can be really challenging to help a parent sometimes understand why an experience felt traumatic to a youth. But that's why, you know, this UCLA index can really help with just helping families understand and take perspective for the youth that's in their family experiencing distress. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about differential diagnosis. So differential diagnosis is the process of evaluating other possible diagnoses with similar symptoms. So it's really key with PTSD because there can be a lot of overlapping symptoms with many types of mental health disorders. So we have overlapping symptoms with depression, anxiety, ADHD, substance use disorders, borderline personality disorder, and many more that aren't included here. So when we're diagnosing youth with PTSD, there's also that compounding factor of the dynamic nature of child development, which we've already kind of touched on. So child development being dynamic can be really, really helpful and a protective factor when working through treatment, but it can also make differential diagnosis challenging. When where a child is at developmentally will impact how they understand what they've experienced and how they present their symptoms, how it impacts their day-to-day life. All of that is going to look different. So some of these factors are part of why Vanderkolk et al. In 2009 presented a proposal to include a new diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder added into the DSM. So it was not added to the most recent DSM-5 TR because there was a lack of empirical data, but I still feel like it's important for us to kind of learn more about why they're looking at that and how that could impact us in our everyday work. So those advocating for the inclusion of that developmental trauma disorder note that PTSD is an adequate diagnosis for folks who maybe experience that single traumatic event and then return to a safe and predictable environment. But according to Vanderkolk et al., the analysis of data from the Chicago Child Trauma Center found that children who experience ongoing traumatic stress in combination with inadequate caregiving systems were 1.5 times more likely than other trauma-exposed children to experience ongoing traumatic stress in combination and meet criteria for a non-trauma related diagnosis. So that supports the complexity that we're touching on today, right? That clinicians face every time they're trying to assess to make an accurate diagnosis to help youth who've experienced trauma. It was noted that children in these cases met inaccurate diagnosis, which leads to a focus on behavioral control without recognition of the root in trauma and how trauma impacts brain development. So we'll share more about trauma-informed treatment modalities next week in our CEU on the 10th. So feel free to join us to hit more at how we kind of work towards treatment with those things. We really will focus on how we meet the needs of those youth outside of just behavioral approaches alone.
And sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, you're fine.
I also love that, like the way that it affects the brain. We're going to talk a lot about like what happens in the neurobiology of that. We'll start that at the end of the presentation today, but it'll be a big part of kind of that treatment led where we kind of steer away from just those behavioral modification and behavioral treatment types.
So we did want to talk a little bit about how unconscious racial bias impacts diagnosis as well. So although this study was focused on adult women in Seng et al. In 2006, they found in a cross-sectional epidemiological data analysis that African-American women were underrepresented in a group diagnosed with PTSD as compared to the general population. They were also less likely to be diagnosed with comorbidities associated with complex PTSD, such as dissociative disorders and borderline personality disorders. They were, however, equally likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder, schizophrenia, and substance use as the general population. So this tells us that African-American women are being diagnosed less accurately when it comes to PTSD and trauma-related diagnoses. So we want to make sure that we're taking time to assess any unconscious bias when diagnosing youth of color to ensure that the most accurate diagnosis is provided in order to inform appropriate treatment planning and culturally sensitive care.
Thanks, Laurel. And that kind of gets us perfectly into kind of some of our additional topics that we're going to be getting into now. And I would assume that anyone joining today works with children in some capacity and understands that, and likely has an experience where the children that you're working with probably come from a various backgrounds, various life experiences, various cultures, or of various gender identities or sexual orientations or race and ethnicities. And so how does all of that kind of play into what we're talking about here today and into the diagnostic and assessment process? And so we're going to kind of talk about some of those cultural considerations, and we're going to start here in a second at like a 500,000 foot view. So what I'm about to share is something that is from a medical journal in psychiatry. And so it's kind of this like overarching view of where as a field we need to move forward in not only our diagnostic criteria and assessment for PTSD, but for really any westernized psychiatric condition. But this article specifically does talk about some of the things that are going to directly relate to trauma disorders or PTSD. So looking kind of beyond the DSM. So in an article published in 2021 in the Journal of Lifelong Learning in Psychiatry, we were able to kind of look at some of these things. So previously mentioned, 70% of the world is experiencing at least one traumatic event. And we can't forget that while this experience of trauma is seemingly universal, the diagnostic constrictions can differ across all of these cultures. So when you were reading this, as I'm reading this article, it's going on to explain that like, while the assumption is that you experience trauma and that can potentially lead to a PTSD diagnosis, that the keys to PTSD cannot be generalized in the same way that that idea can. So sure, you can have trauma in any culture and it can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms. But if we're not careful about the way that we look at those symptoms and the way that we look at those reactions, we're going to miss the mark with certain cultures and certain groups of people. So what we're looking at here is kind of 4 main areas for cross-cultural trauma reactions that really, really, really need to be evaluated. And so the first area that we're getting into is the reactions of PTSD can vary across cultures. And so in 2011, a comprehensive narrative review of cross-cultural differences and the prevalence of PTSD symptom clusters was discovered. So there was kind of 2 independent studies that took place. One was working with Vietnamese refugees and one was working with Kalahari Bushmen, or refugees, Kalahari Bushmen, people have been affected by that in Cambodia. I understand both of these are different countries and not the youth that we're working with are maybe not directly experiencing these issues, but hang in there with me. So what we were able to see is that some of the more biological symptoms, so some of those arousal symptoms and some of those re-experiencing symptoms were seen a little bit more universally, but the affective abnormalities and behavior symptoms were seen less universally. So we needed to really look at like, how does that affect your affect if you are a part of this culture? And so the idea here is that socialization, cultural socialization is going to kind of help everybody who's born into a culture and raised in a culture understand what behaviors are good, bad, punishable, exciting, things like that. And so that is going to affect the way that people react to trauma, the behaviors that they share openly, the way that they manage their own behaviors. And so we can get into situations where we may not be all experiencing the same reaction to trauma as it is behaviorally. I might not be behaving in the way that, you know, the criteria specify. However, I've still experienced, you know, that trauma. A lot of this can also come through with some of the somatic symptoms that people experience. So we hear a lot about like increased body heat or sleep paralysis when exposed to these trauma triggers, even though those aren't things that people are talking about when they're talking about avoiding. So for example, I might be able to express that when I am reminded of a traumatic experience I have or am exposed to a trauma trigger, my body heat increases, but that doesn't necessarily correlate perfectly to me avoiding doing that because of that. I'm not saying I'm avoiding exposure to that trigger. I'm avoiding that large crowd, or I'm avoiding whatever that is because my body heat increases. But in my culture, I may be able to share that that is what's happening. And so we want to make sure that we're able as providers to kind of do the investigation, to get a little deeper into that and understand, what does that youth mean by sharing that? What does that individual mean when they're sharing that? And then also, do our assessment tools allow us to be able to look into that? Another area where we need to ensure cultural competency when doing assessment and diagnostics is in idioms of distress. And an idiom of distress, I'm going to share a few with you here if you're unaware of what they are. And the ones I'm going to share with you are more predominantly used in US culture. So you're going to go, oh yeah, I know what that means. But we can talk about some others that are not necessarily used in the US all of the time. So an idiom of distress is a culturally bound or culturally constructed way to communicate distress or suffering. And so this is going to be something that is very localized, which is why we don't see it come up in our diagnostic criteria or in our assessments, because it can't necessarily be applied. Like, its relevance is not global or universal, its relevance is very local. So we have to understand the local culture we're working with and learn some of these idioms. Idioms of distress for someone who is potentially maybe like low income or in an unstable family dynamic would be like the phrase walking on eggshells. That is an idiom of distress of explaining that I'm in an environment that I do not feel comfortable all the time in, that I am anxious about setting someone off or getting into it or kind of like disrupting whatever sort of piece there may be. So that would be an example of an idiom of distress. Another idiom of distress that is not so much, it's maybe not as familiar to us as US citizens, is there in the Latinx culture, there is something, and I think it's, I'm going to butcher this, but nervosia or nervosius. And essentially it is a word used to describe all of the symptoms of anxiety, but that is not how they describe those. They use that kind of phrase to describe that. You'll also hear like baby blues is an idiom of distress for like a postpartum woman. So it's not us getting into like the actual symptoms or the actual experiences of that suffering, but it's kind of this phrase that generalizes that. And if you're a part of that culture, you understand what goes into that. So as providers, we have to understand these idioms of distress when working with individuals of different culture. So we're not missing maybe symptoms or other criteria that people are displaying. The third area here is explanatory models of illness. And this really refers to like a cultural group's viewpoints on the nature of their illness and why they're experiencing it, maybe what caused it, or the perception of what caused it, and the solutions associated with help seeking. So this can include why a traumatic event occurred. So this could be maybe supernatural forces punishing a family or a community. This could be a karmic reaction, kind of all of those type things. And it's important that we understand these so that during the assessment process, one, to help inform the treatment, there's a specific kind of way that we need to go about caring for someone's culture, and also helping them maybe understand some different causes of what's going on in a culturally competent way. And we're going to talk about that next week in our treatment and intervention CEU on the same topic. But it's important that we understand that so that we can kind of decipher maybe what is serious and what isn't serious, and kind of understand the way that they're conceptualizing their experience. And then the last thing that we really need to make sure we're doing for kind of cross-cultural trauma assessment and diagnosis is evaluating ongoing stressors. And I think this is the second or third time that this has come up in our conversation so far, is that a lot of, the current PTSD diagnostic process, and if you read through the DSM, they do talk about this, but it's not part of that criteria and process to understand that daily stressful events impact people's ability to cope with larger trauma constantly. And then if people are in these resource constrained settings and they're experiencing poverty related stress or vulnerability to sexual violence or food insecurity or lack of resources or insecure housing or ongoing discrimination, that's going to really affect the way that they're able to engage in PTSD treatment. And then it's also going to affect the way that some of their symptoms present, because it is this ongoing thing. It is this kind of forever and ever kind of experience they're having. It's not, hey, I just had this event and now I'm traumatized. And so we really have to be able to understand kind of that ongoing stressor so that we can figure out like how we need to approach something and what are some of the other barriers that our client is experiencing. So these are the four main areas that this study says we need to focus on to ensure that we're providing culturally competent assessments in diagnostics. And so they kind of have some different different advice on like how to reach these three things. And the first one of that is creating culturally sensitive assessment tools. And there's a lot of ways that we can do this. This is something that definitely has to happen at the macro level so that these can be provided to us. But as it pertains to the work that we do individually with kiddos, it is important that we're aware that our tools may not be culturally sensitive, and that maybe we're using some additional tools to supplement the current tools we're using to create that culturally sensitive kind of overview of what's going on until we're able to get these better tools created at a more macro level. The second is practicing cultural humility. And that is really just focused on understanding what you don't know about other cultures and not making assumptions about anything. And so if you joined us in our webinars, both last spring and last fall, we kind of talked about cultural humility a little bit and the ability to recognize what I don't know and where I need to seek supervision, where I need to seek consultation, and really understanding how to best help our clients. I was actually talking to a fellow clinician of mine that I went to undergrad and grad school with in preparation for this, and she was talking about shame in Asian cultures, and that she, in her practice with children, really has to sometimes work around the idea that, like, as clinicians, innately shame to us is negative and it's going to have negative impacts. Like, that's kind of how we're trained. That's what some of the science shows us. But if you're working with a culture where shame is part of the way that they parent, the way that they engage with one another, the way that, like, something that's motivating and things like that, you have to find a way to, one, relearn about shame. That's that cultural humility. I don't understand this from this perspective. And then on the back end of that, the ability to kind of deconstruct, how do I explain what some of these negative effects could be while also keeping them intact with their culture and helping ensure these clients and families still feel connected to who they are and their cultural identity. Again, we'll talk more about that in the treatment phase of this, CEU next week. And then the third is incorporating cross-cultural trauma reactions into treatment. And so that is really those trauma reactions that we were talking about in that first section, where they're different, they could look different. We're looking at like some of those somatic symptoms. We're looking at maybe different ways that people react based on their culture, based on the cultural socialization of behavior, and ensuring that that is part of our assessments and that that is something that we're looking at when we're planning treatment, as well as when we're assessing for diagnosis. So that is the 500,000 foot view of kind of where we need to go with PTSD assessment and diagnosis, and where we're kind of missing the mark, and what their current research is hoping to do for us here in the next, few years.
Alex, if I can just add to, I think it's also always important, and this kind of rolls under that cultural humility piece, that although we want to gather information from the families and their experiences, it's also not their job to educate us on cultural competence, right, within their culture.
Exactly.
So remembering that we need to, as you said, seek supervision and the appropriate resources to educate ourselves, while still including obviously their perspective and gathering that information from them. That's also not their weight to bear for us as providers or folks interacting with families of different cultures. So
100%. Brittany, I see you're unmuted. Do we have a question?
I do, yes. One of the questions was, does the racial bias in diagnosis carry over to children as well? Any research on that?
So that is part of our lack of research that we have run into. I think that it is probably safe to assume that it does. I don't know that it's largely different. I know that we do see, I don't have the research in front of me, so I don't want to cite anything specific, but I do know that there is research out there talking about how like Black adolescent American males are more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder or explosive, mood dysregulation disorder, another more kind of like conduct disorder type or behavioral disorder type diagnosis versus some of the others. Laurel, this is something I know that you've kind of encountered in your work, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I echo that. I mean, essentially, Alex and I looked for research specifically looking at children and that racial bias, but everything was focused on adults. And part of that is because it's hard to do research with children in general, right? It's just a complicating factor of getting that approved and working through all those pieces. But we kind of are drawing the conclusions based on the amount of research we saw with adults, that there's no reason why that wouldn't, kind of repeat back down to children and youth we see as well. And just there's lots of research that says in general, like children of color are always seen as older. They're kind of unconsciously viewed often as more aggressive. And so just kind of knowing that what the research shows about unconscious racial bias in general, that's going to all play into how we perceive symptomology and where that would fall in for diagnosis.
Thanks, Laurel. And then let's see. So honestly, kind of piggybacking off of that question, a fantastic question. We're going to kind of break it down into like some different populations that you potentially or most likely are working with, and kind of what does that look like on a more individual or micro level, now that we've kind of talked about this like macro level concept. So our next slide here kind of goes through, it's kind of a quadruple Venn diagram of some of the things that need to be considered. And this is going to be off the basis of LGBTQIA youth. The original graphic of this that I found included the experiences of an LGBTQIA plus veteran. I have modified this graphic to be more in line with the experiences of an LGBTQIA identifying youth. But we know that LGBTQIA plus individuals are likely to experience socially produced stressors due to their identities. That's minority stress theory. That definitely is applicable to racial and ethnic minorities, and really anyone who is in some way a minority in our culture. So there are kind of two different experiences. You can have external or distal experiences, which are the experiences of discrimination, of maybe like policies that aren't in support of you or do not protect you, but they're all external. Maybe it's like not being able to get housing or not being able to get a job because of the way that you identify or who you are as a person. And then you have internal, which is more so as it relates to the LGBTQIA community, trying to figure out like when to disclose your identity, when not to disclose your identity, when to kind of come out, who to come out to. I think anyone who's worked with LGBTQIA individuals or is involved in that community understands that coming out is not a one-time thing, not something that happens with every new person that you meet. It's a decision of whether or not you have to do that, or you're going to, or you feel psychologically safe to. And then another part of that internal kind of struggle is some of the internal homophobia or stigmatization that we see because of religious trauma or for other reasons, through just some different value-based ways people are raised or things like that. So when we're looking at any mental health condition, it's imperative that we assure that we're associating, or that we're assessing them with this culturally competent view. And criterion A traumas specifically are events that involved actual or threatened death, but that doesn't include discrimination of any kind. So that's where things get a little bit confusing. So we have criterion A trauma over here. So I saw a gay community member unlawfully and violently detained and arrested at an LGBTQIA rights rally in my hometown. That's kind of bordering criterion A and discrimination. Our like straight up criterion A experience here would be I was cornered in the school bathroom by other students who threatened to get rid of me if I didn't leave the school on my own, dead or alive. So this is more an example of like that extreme bullying that would fit into that criterion A trauma of like, hey, I experienced a risk of death or threatened death or severe injury. And then again, in kind of the crossover between criterion A and discrimination, we have the experience of an LGBTQIA plus member in my community recently being killed as a result of a hate crime. When we're looking at discrimination, I've kind of have in here that the request to create a gay straight alliance student group was denied with no explanation at my school, and I was not allowed to bring a same-sex date to my prom as a result of other parent complaints. So those are discriminations that this child is facing. Some minority stress factors that they're kind of feeling is that being in the closet is in and of itself traumatizing. So whether this child is out of the closet or not, having that as part of their story can be traumatizing and as part of that minority stress. And then constantly evaluating if I'm safe enough to disclose my identity is exhausting and anxiety inducing. For our microaggression over here, we have the principal tells my teachers this probably is just a phase that I'll grow out of. And then for kind of a combination of discrimination, minority stress, and microaggression, we have school admin tricked me into outing a close friend under the guise of getting them needed help. And so all of this is a point to say that this is really trauma by 1,000 cuts. This is that ongoing stress we're talking about. Sure, there is that criterion A trauma in the scenario that is a little bit more black and white, but even if this child didn't have this specific experience, it is very likely that all of these are going to create those PTSD symptoms or lead to those PTSD symptoms. And so when we're evaluating members of minorities or who are experiencing this combination of discrimination, minority stress, microaggressions, we have to really be able to be flexible in the way that we see criterion A trauma. And I know that can get murky when you're talking about official diagnosis, but when we're looking at treatment, that is where this really comes into play of like, what can we do for this kiddo, and where can we see that even if you don't meet that specific criteria, you're still struggling in that same way because of some of these experiences. So that obviously can be applied, like I said, to anybody who experiences minority stress. And so that goes beyond just the LGBTQIA plus community. So in talking a little bit about racism and PTSD. So we know that 50 to 60% of Black Americans report personal discrimination based on their race, and that is personal discrimination. So we're not talking about systematic racism and like the systems implications of that. We're not talking about experiencing racism that is not maybe directed at a specific person. This is personal discrimination. And this again is also self-reported. So it's likely that this is maybe not an accurate number entirely. Historically, as examinations of PTSD risk factors have not included exposure to racism. And while we know that racial discrimination remains a frequent occurrence, we have to kind of do something about that. So what two different studies have shown is that in 2014, there was in the International Journal on the Biology of Stress, there was a literature review that reviewed all of the different kind of neurohormonal changes that experiencing discrimination can lead to. And what this kind of literature review, so they're looking at all of these different resources and the consistencies between them. And so what we were able to say is that experiencing discrimination does lead to increased cortisol production and release in our brain, which drastically changes the way that our brains function, the way that our brains are built, the way that we kind of function within kind of all the different parts of our brain function together. So we know that that can be toxic in high doses, right? We know cortisol is really great in low doses because it keeps us safe. It helps us evaluate danger if we need that. It can help, that adrenaline, that like, what do I need? Fight, flight, or freeze. But we also know that when that cortisol level stays high and is continually experienced, it is damaging our brain. It is not healthy for our brain. And so this kind of literature review really leaned into what some of those biological experiences were. Another study that we were looking at was was published just this past January in 2024. And in this study, they were looking at the likelihood that racial discrimination is a risk factor for PTSD, not necessarily saying that racial discrimination can cause PTSD, but what they were looking at was the effect of racial discrimination over time on someone's ability to cope with additional trauma. And what they were able to find is that when a person has experienced racial discrimination and then they experience that single traumatic event or that trigger event for PTSD, they are more likely to struggle with more severe PTSD and chronic PTSD, as well as more likely to develop that PTSD if they've experienced racial trauma. Their ability to cope with that event is significantly impaired. And so that was really insightful for me when I was doing this research, because we're working with kids, we're working with the pre to that a lot of times, right? So if we're working with youth of color in our communities who do not qualify for a PTSD diagnosis, it's important for us to understand that some of these experiences they're having are putting them at higher risk. So if I have an individual who is explaining a single maybe traumatic event to me and they have a history of being discriminated against, I'm going to take that into consideration in both their diagnostic assessment, but also in their treatment, understanding that their symptoms are probably going to be more severe. They're going to be more chronic. It's going to be harder for them to kind of recover from some of that because of that previously experienced and ongoing experience, racial discrimination and trauma. So that's kind of one side of this. And then we also saw another study that was recently published in 2024 that linked the experiences of racial discrimination to PTSD symptoms, which led to a potential increase in suicidality in youth. And so we're seeing that between the years of 2007 and 2020, there was a 144% increase in suicide rates for Black youth between the ages of 10 and 17. And what they kind of started looking into was, in addition, not just experiences of racial discrimination, but experiences of online racial discrimination. So kind of getting into that cyberbullying concept. And so in 2020, there were 525 Black children and teens ages 19 to 11 that were evaluated for this. And the researchers looked at online racial discrimination directed specifically to the individual, such as like a racist meme or messaging. And then in response to online racism, the children and teens that the study looked at, I lost my page. Sorry. The children and teens that the study looked at had increased several symptoms of PTSD. They were including feeling really on guard all of the time. They were isolated. They were having intrusive thoughts that wouldn't go away. They were having that uncontrollable distress. And so they're seeing that massive spike in PTSD symptoms. And we know that PTSD has a link to suicidality because of some of those more depressive symptoms that can be experienced. Michael Lindsay, who is the dean of the Paulette Goddard Professor, who's the dean and Paulette Goddard Professor of Social Work at the New York University Silver School of Social Work, said that witnessing the evidence of harm being done to Black people, either by law enforcement or vigilantes, can create a sense of helplessness or hopelessness in Black adolescents about their future. The exposure can also influence their mental health long-term, leading them further into depression by making them anxious. And so this goes back, I think we had a question earlier about that kind of like media experience. And so this kind of speaks to that. Well, it's not necessarily going to meet the criteria outright. It again is something that needs to deeply, deeply be considered when we are talking about working with this population. We're talking about these struggles within this population or within these different populations. And then additionally, this quote I found really, really, really impactful as providers and kind of just trying to figure out how do we treat this? How do we work with these kiddos? But Dr. Amanda Calhoun, who is the chief resident of Yale University's Albert J. Sonlit, integrated adult child psychiatric program said, I really think a primary driver of the declining mental health that we're seeing in Black children are experiences of anti-Black racism. There's little to no standardized training in how to help Black children navigate being a Black child in America and experiencing racism. And so that is kind of a call for a lot of research that needs to be done, a lot of information that we need to gather so that we can better equip our clinicians and our social service people when working with this population. Brittany?
Yep, I have just a couple questions in the Q&A. One of them is, I'm curious if the study revealed where in the country the children lived.
And are you referring to this? I wonder if that's in reference to what there's 3 studies linked here, but let me see if my notes say that here. If you're talking about, so no, none of these are saying other than their American youth. So we're not getting any specific location for any of these studies.
Okay. And then the second question was, is there any research on how generational trauma impacts this?
Laurel, do you want to maybe, I mean, I saw your face, so
I know. I mean,
had something jump in.
so I didn't look at any specific research in preparation for this presentation, but I mean, I definitely think that that is a important factor and something to look deeper into, because just as we're talking about the brain changes with you know, these more typical trauma exposures, just the way that the research is showing that racism causes the same, you know, physiological changes, that's going to change our brain, which is going to change, you know, genetics and all of those physical pieces that we pass down, as well as just the way we interact and parent. All of those pieces are really impactful. So I wish I had like a really research-based answer. I don't, other than to just say that's a wonderful question. And I think it's important to dig deeper into that for sure.
Yeah, no, I definitely would echo that. I think that understanding like that neurobiological effect. So understanding like from the medical, from like that biology, what we're dealing with and where, you know, there may need to be some additional supports even prior to a PTSD diagnosis or anything like that. Because it really is going to affect, again, not only PTSD, but any sort of mental health diagnosis or struggle that a child is having.
Yeah, definitely.
Brittany, is that your only questions?
Yep, that's all for now.
Okay. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of gave you a tool. So I know we talked about that 500,000 foot view of everything that needs to happen in the field of psychiatry and psychology and social services to really bolster and ensure culturally competent assessment, intervention, and treatment. But I wanted to make sure we also talked about a specific tool that you guys can start using today if you need to. And so this is the cultural formulation interview. I'm not sure if anyone's ever used this, but it's located in the back of the DSM. And it really is something that I would recommend using as an additional assessment in any assessment you're doing. And so this is something where you're really just looking at the cultural definition of the problem, trying to understand, you know, if you think you do an assessment, let's say you think that a child has PTSD, then you want to kind of go back and be like, what is the cultural definition of that traumatic experience, of having those trauma symptoms, of having that kind of, that symptomology, that presentation, all of that. How does that culture understand that? And how is that kind of impacting the information I'm getting? And then again, will impact the treatment I'm planning. 2 is cultural perceptions of the cause, context, and support, including cultural identity. So we talked a little bit about this when we talked about those explanatory models of illness, but it's really the perception of like what caused this traumatic event or what caused the trauma that has led me to be struggling with trauma in a way that I'm seeking some sort of trauma-related diagnosis. What's the context of what's going on? And then again, what support do I have? So how does my cultural identity maybe link me to some different supports or not link me to some different supports, and how can those be accessed? Domain 3 is going to be the cultural factors that affect self-coping and past help seeking. And so that's us really trying to understand like how an individual is viewing their ability to cope, the healthy coping mechanisms, things like that, as well as like seeking help, seeking treatment, seeking guidance, and what that kind of, what the viewpoint within the client is, or maybe within the family. I think that that's kind of an interesting thing that we see sometimes when working with youth, is maybe a youth is seeking help for something that a family maybe doesn't view in the same way or doesn't see in the same severity as the youth is experiencing it. And so that can really help kind of give us some insight into that. And then domain 4 is the cultural factors that affect current help seeking. And so those are kind of, again, that like current help seeking thing. So maybe this is something where they haven't seeked help seeked help in the past, and now they're seeking help currently, or like they, in what is the future from the past. And so we want to be able to understand how culture is affecting all of those different decisions. And so again, this is located in the back of your DSM. It has some really, really detailed information on how to go through each of these domains in this cultural formulation interview to kind of ensure that cultural assessment. But I wanted to make sure we gave you guys like a tangible tool that you could start using today if you wanted to when working with traumatized youth. So now we're going to talk a little bit about trauma and how it changes the brain. So this is our brain, and we're going to kind of talk about each of these different areas of our brain. And let me catch my notes up here just to make sure that I'm not missing anything for you guys. So we have our prefrontal cortex here at the front of our brain, and our cerebral cortex kind of overarching the top. We have our amygdala here, which is the small little oval, and then it has this kind of cloud-like thing on the back of it called our hippocampus, and then this blue area up here is our thalamus. And so we're going to kind of go through what each of these things does, each of these areas of the brain does, and then how they're affected when kids are experiencing trauma. So our thalamus processes sight and sound. So anything that we're seeing or hearing first is being processed by our thalamus. It then goes to our amygdala after our thalamus kind of makes its own assertions about what we're seeing or what we're hearing. Amygdala is our alert center. It is going to be the fight, fight, or freeze. It's kind of our danger, our alert. It's our like kind of emotional response. You hear people say like adrenaline rush, all of that. That's your amygdala. Your amygdala also is the first place that your body processes touch and smell. And so we will see kids be more triggered by touch and smell, or more easily triggered by touches and smells than we will maybe those sight and sound, because it's not going through that processing in the thalamus. They're not going through any sort of evaluation. They're just going to the amygdala. And if that amygdala has been affected by trauma, it's going to have a really hard time differentiating safe from unsafe. And so most likely we're seeing those trauma reactions a little more frequently when it comes to reminders via touch or reminders via like olfactory senses and smell. Our hippocampus is this little cloud-like, I'm not a brain surgeon or brain scientist, so if I'm using kind of weird language, I apologize, but this little cloud like shape here is our hippocampus. And this is where we really add context from experiences and memories. So if something comes, let's say that I see something, for example, I see a garden hose in the yard and I think it's a snake. So, and I panic. Basically what's happening is my thalamus is seeing the garden hose and it's seeing a snake, right? Where we haven't processed that it's a garden hose. And then my amygdala is going into my amygdala and I'm jumping back because I'm like, whoa, snake. I don't like snakes. Ooh, I don't like snakes. And so I'm having that fear response. And then that stimuli is going directly into my hippocampus, where my hippocampus is like, oh yeah, I watered yesterday. Oh yeah, I left the hose out. It's able to add context from experiences and memories to help me evaluate safety. So it's able to kind of regulate that amygdala, bring that back down a little bit, and help me differentiate if I'm safe or not. But if I'm unable to get to my hippocampus, if my amygdala reacts in a way where the reaction is already happening, let's say that I hit a full-fledged flashback from a traumatic experience I had with a snake, the hippocampus doesn't have the opportunity to provide that kind of extra context and memories needed for that kind of processing. And then we have our cerebral and prefrontal cortexes. And so this is really the reasoning and problem solving area of the brain. It's also impulse control and amygdala regulation. It's also where we see some of the largest brain effects in kids who've experienced trauma, is kind of an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. So we're talking about kids who are having increased. So to Laurel's point, developmentally, we're already seeing some interesting things with problem solving and impulse control, because that's all part of child development. But then when you add trauma on top of that, we're seeing kind of like an increased struggle in those areas, because those parts of their brains are not functioning adequately to be able to kind of process all of the information that's coming and going, and what's safe and what's not, and what impulses do I need to control in terms of like behaviors and reactions versus others. And so that's when we kind of see that whole experience of trauma and all of those behaviors are truly linked to brain science. So we might see the disassociation, we might see the aggression, we might see the like the AWOL attempt or like the elopement due to flight. But what we have to understand is it's not just behavioral, it's the way that their brain is built. And if we're not gearing treatment towards changing the neural pathways in their brain, we're really not treating the root cause of the issue. So again, so this is a really cool study personally that I think, this is essentially the MRI of a healthy 11-year-old male and who has not experienced any trauma over here on the right. And this is a maltreated 11-year-old male. And these are some of the highlighted areas are going to be some of the differences that you're seeing here. So the first thing that you're going to see here is that these areas, so this one right here, and these down here. So those 4 areas are what's called ventricles, and they're going to have enlarged ventricles. Enlarged ventricles are linked directly to an increase of cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. And I'm going to launch a polling question because I really want to see if anyone has the answer of what an increase in cerebral spinal fluid in the brain can result in. So let's hop back here and launch this polling question. So what do enlarged ventricles, which leads to an increase of cerebral spinal fluid in the brain, result in? I'll give everyone a 30 or so seconds here. In the poll, we can look at the results. I'm not going to share all of them, but I will read some of them for you. I think you might be able to see them. But so compression of the brain, emotional regulation, stroke, infection, loss of memory, more emotional problems, cognitive delay, trauma experience. So all of these are kind of right in the area, but specifically, or more specifically, we know that enlarged ventricles and increased cerebral spinal fluid in the brain is directly linked to the experience of flashbacks. So children who have this increased spinal fluid due to these enlarged ventricles are much more likely to have those flashbacks that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. The next difference that we can see here is kind of this little area right here. So you can see this area compared to this area. This one is much larger, and this is the size of the amygdala. So in the brain on the left, on the right, we can see that the amygdala is, on the left it's small and almond, on the right it's much larger. And so that is going to impact the ability for the amygdala to accurately process stress. It's going to be overreactive. It's going to be really jumping into that fight or flight state. And we know that when children are dysregulated, it's really hard to complete treatment with them. It's really hard to kind of get progress made. And so we're really needing to make sure that we're calming the amygdala, providing that type of environment. And so the last noticeable difference is the space between the brain and the skull. And there is still a lot of question around why this space exists, but ultimately what we're seeing is that this brain is smaller than this brain. And it's not clear whether or not the brain develops smaller because of the exposure to stress, or if the exposure to stress causes the brain to shrink. That's not yet known. But that is something that we're seeing as just a smaller brain development in children who have experienced trauma. Okay. And Brittany, I saw you come off mute. I don't know if you have any questions or. Okay, I think she's probably good. Okie dokie. So moving on to living with PTSD. So what does all of this kind of result in? We talked about the symptoms and the criteria and what that looks like, but we're talking about teens too, and we're talking about child development, and we're kind of talking about all of that. So kids that are living with PTSD are experiencing those flashbacks, and that might come through as that can be more outward or more inward in terms of the presentation of that. I've seen kids have flashbacks where they're not speaking, they're not moving, they're not saying anything, they're kind of disassociated. And then I've also seen kiddos have flashbacks with a lot of behavior associated with that. There's a kind of a constant stream of memories happening, a constant awareness of trying to like mitigate my trauma response. So think about being, in middle school, elementary school, high school, and also trying to do that, trying to mitigate the memories of what's going on, or maybe what's happening or what had happened to you, or like, hey, I was in a big crowd, or that happened in a big crowd, kind of speaking to some of the active shooter things and then trying to just mitigate that while engaging in everything that we ask our children to engage in every day. It's likely that these children are struggling with nightmares and insomnia and having trouble sleeping consistently. They're feeling numb, so they're struggling with probably some of their social emotional development. We're seeing that increased anger and irritability, which is very quick to be labeled in our systems that we have for kids now. Like those two behaviors, I feel like are often punished or, try to be quickly modified, which if it's true anger and irritability, that's totally fine. But when there's symptoms of PTSD, again, we're not treating that root cause, which is that brain development issue. They're withdrawing from friends and interests. They're easily startled. They're having trouble focusing. So they're struggling in school likely, or they're avoiding different things, or they're easily triggered by reminders. And so, all of these things can be linked to other behaviors. Maybe we're seeing self-harm or we're seeing some of that suicidal ideation. Teens specifically are probably going to display more impulsive or aggressive behaviors. So again, if we're seeing those kids consistently displaying impulsive and aggressive behaviors, like maybe looking beyond what's wrong with you, more so what happened to you, what are we missing? Is there something that we need to know about? Again, that association between PTSD and suicidality, we know that suicide is the leading cause of death, or the second leading cause of death, I think. I can't remember the exact data. It's from a different webinar, but it's a top leading cause of death in children between 10 and 25. And so knowing that, it's important that we understand that when PTSD is linked to suicidality, that we are, keeping that at the forefront of the conversations that we're having with these kids. Teens may also struggle to maintain old and build new relationships due to PTSD symptoms. So it can be difficult. It's already hard to have friends as a teenager or as a child, or kind of mitigate all of those social relationships. And so trying to do that with PTSD is going to really, really be extra difficult. And then a perceived lack of motivation. It can look like to adults or outsiders that the child just doesn't want to do anything. And that's not really what's happening. They're more kind of frozen in that state of trauma. So that's a little bit what it looks like to live with PTSD as a child. And Laurel, I'll let you kind of close us out here.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot today about, how trauma impacts youth we're working with. It's important for us also to be aware of that working with youth who've experienced trauma can also impact us, right? And so we want to take some time to talk about caring for ourselves as we wrap up today. So we want to make sure we're aware of any signs of compassion fatigue, burnout, or vicarious trauma. So according to SAMHSA, some of the signs to watch out for are emotional and physical exhaustion, feeling like nothing you're doing to help youth is helping anymore, any signs of depression, lack of connection with others, not feeling creative any longer. Any of those can be signs and symptoms of burnout and vicarious trauma. So a helpful resource that we want to kind of share with everyone is called the ProQual. So it's the Professional Quality of Life questionnaire. And so it is a tool and you can use it multiple times. So I've taken it throughout my career, and depending on where you're at, it's going to show you a different assessment based on your current responses, because obviously the way we're feeling is going to change day to day and year to year as well. So it's really helpful just to kind of assess if you are maybe experiencing burnout, and kind of really looking at those symptoms you might be experiencing, and encompasses more symptoms than what we just discussed as well. So if you're interested in taking the ProQual, it is included in our reference page. So you can go to the website that we've included, so you can kind of take that and just kind of gauge where you're at. I encourage everyone to do it and do it on a regular basis, just to kind of keep a tap into how you're feeling and how you're managing stress in day to day. And so there's lots of ways, though, then once you have the ProQual and you know where you're at, that we need to think about how we can take care of ourselves and different tools we can use. The important thing to think about is really what's going to work best for you as an individual. And so for me, physical exercise is something that's always been really helpful, but for some people it can be gardening, reading, knitting, boxing, watching sports. I mean, whatever kind of falls within you and kind of helps you feel full as a human is going to help you to take care of that stress and trauma that you're experiencing with youth. So recently, though, a clinician on my team shared with our team a resource that's really transformed my understanding of how to take care of myself. And that's it has a deeper, more sustainable model for self-care, and that's called trauma stewardship. So you can see on the slide here, we have a tiny survival guide from the Trauma Stewardship Institute. It gives you some examples of different things you can use to help take care of yourself. But trauma stewardship, the book's called Trauma Stewardship, An Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. It's by Laura Lipsky. And it defines trauma stewardship as a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to hardship, pain, and trauma experienced by humans, other living beings, or our planet itself. So those who support trauma stewardship believe that both joy and pain are realities of life, and that suffering can be transformed into meaningful growth and healing when a quality of presence is cultivated and maintained even in the face of great suffering. So this resource really taught me tangible, sustainable tools in my everyday practice. So like I mentioned here on the slide, you have some different examples. And as we started our presentation, Alex and I talked about what our why was. And so that is a piece of trauma stewardship as well. So kind of as we wrap up today, we just want everyone to take a moment to think about what your why is. And we will put up a polling question. The caveat, the thing I'll add is that you really want to think about what's your why today. Today, showing up in this moment, what's your why? So not thinking back to 10 years ago when you started in your career or last week or yesterday, but really thinking about every day, what's your why and why you show up. So Alex, if you want to share that poll, and if folks want to give us some responses on what their whys are, we would love to hear some of your responses.
Absolutely. So I just launched that poll so people can take some time to get that answered. And I'm just going to click through our reference slides here. So you'll be seeing what you'll get. And I want to go through some housekeeping things that I missed at the beginning. So you should be prompted to take a survey after the conclusion of this training, and that will provide you with your CEU certificate. If you have any issues accessing that survey and do not receive your CEU certificate, you can email me directly, or you can reach out through our website and I will make sure to get that to you timely. We will be sharing the PDF of these slides. It does take a while for us to get those sent out, so just be patient with us. It'll probably be out within the next week or so. And then this is being recorded, and our marketing team will post the recording and let you know when that's available for view. I'm not sure if that gets sent out post training. So I don't want to promise you that, but it may be included with the slides. If not, it will be posted to our website and to our YouTube page for people to view in the future. Unfortunately, we aren't able to offer CEUs for people viewing the recording, just due to some of the different stipulations set by like the BSRB and the Professional Licensing Board in Missouri. So we won't be able to provide CEU certificates. However, if you feel like this would be good for any other training opportunity you need, that is out there and is accessible. If you want to go back and watch any of our past webinars, which I think in total we've done maybe like 15 of them so far on a multitude of different topics, feel free to do so as well. Those are also located on YouTube and our website. So I'm going to go ahead. I don't want to end the poll quite yet because we're still getting answers. Brittany, is there any outstanding questions?
Not that I see.
Okay, well then I am going to go ahead and end this poll so we can just maybe see some of these answers. And I am going to stop sharing my screen really quick. So let's.
Alex, did you say that you would put the link up for the survey? That is one of the questions.
No, when they exit out of this, it should like automatically open.
It'll go straight to the survey. Okay, just want to make sure we got that question answered.
Yeah, so looking at some of the whys, just so everyone can kind of leave on that positive note, it's changed over the years. Currently, it's being a part of the professional growth of individuals I supervise, which ultimately aids in helping others. We have seeing my students each day and observing their wonderful growth, to be helpful to young children and their caregivers, to have support when they experience trauma, to make a positive impact in children's lives. Helping build resiliency is my why. Supporting people of all ages to heal is my why. I love that. I really identify with that. Being able to better understand and help the population of kids I work with, seeing progress and glimmers of resiliency in my clients, et cetera. So you guys have some really wonderful whys, and utilizing your why as a motivation is really helpful in some of that self-care work that we have previously been referencing. So I really appreciate everyone's attendance today, and we really hope that you join us next week for kind of the second part of this to really talk about what that culturally competent intervention and treatment is going to look like. We're going to go through treatment in some different settings. So, everything from acute care to just maybe things that parents can do at the dinner table with their kids. We're going to talk about a gamut of those and really get into a case study of one of the kiddos that we've served at Camber and some of the different ways that we were able to really robustly treat their PTSD. So thank you so much for your time today. And it's been wonderful having you all here.